I want to thank you for all coming. This is the 10th lecture in the Acton 250 series. So we're really racking some up, yeah. And so we have to thank our sponsors, the Acton 250 Committee. That's Steve Trimble, our chair, but he's going to give you a little commercial in a second. And ActonTV, who's recording this, and then also the Friends of Pine Rock, which I'm a member of, and is a group that's founded here in Acton about 20 years ago. And we put on a number of lectures about archaeology and Native American history. Good stuff, too. I just want to call your attention, there's these tables in the back that Ann is taking care of. Memorabilia and other previous speakers we've had, their books are there. And also Daniel's books are going to be sold in that back corner. But that's for later. Actually, Steve, do you want to do your commercial now? Sure. Yeah.
As Bob said, thanks for coming. Just a couple things. So, as you know, ActonTV gets a lot of their programming from cable subscriptions, which are declining as people unplug. So if you're interested in becoming a member or contributing to ActonTV, there's UPC-coded cards in the back. We've restocked our store, and this is a sort of a cheap Christmas plug, but we have a couple of specials out for holidays that we've been working on. So you get a free shot glass if you get these. There's a few signs in the back and on the wall, so you can see the details there. But if you're looking for a last-minute Christmas gift, we make a small amount off of each item sold, and it does support programming like this. So if you're looking for a last-minute gift, we've got some nice coffee mugs, shot glasses. The wine glass that's here, there's a few samples here, but we have a brand new wine glass. But please check the website. There's UPC codes on the red, white, and blue things there, and we'd really appreciate your support there. Thank you, Bob.
Sure. Okay. I mentioned this will be the 10th lecture we have coming up. But there's a lot of other great activities going on that Acton 250 and partners, frankly, are figuring out and are putting on the docket. And one of the most exciting ones for us is one that we never saw coming. A very enterprising young man in this town, an AB graduate, not a graduate yet, I'm sorry, a student, decided that he wanted to put on a scavenger hunt for a bunch of students in town. And he'd like to tell you about it. This is great. You'll love it. Yeah, Aaron, come on up.
Hello, everyone. I hope you're all doing well. I'm Arian Aurora, a local Eagle Scout candidate from Troop 32. For my Eagle project, I worked with Acton's 250 committee to create a historical scavenger hunt about the American Revolution for AB's fifth graders to engage the next generation in celebrating the 250th anniversary of the American Revolution and the birth of our nation. This past October 7th, the Acton Minutemen and I visited all 6 elementary schools to introduce the scavenger hunt to the 5th grade. The scavenger hunt itself takes students through 8 historical locations in Acton, Concord, and Lexington from the eyes of an Acton Minuteman serving under the Revered Captain Isaac Davis. At each site, students read an immersive description that places them in the events that unfolded there, as if they were one of the Acton Minutemen experiencing these events in real time. They then search for an outlined key scavenger, which, through their discovery, helped them fully understand the significance of each historical site in an engaging way. So far, we've received excellent feedback from our hosts at the Acton Historical Society and the 5th grade teachers, who have voiced that the 5th graders are very excited to complete the scavenger hunt. I'm a firm believer that to ensure the lasting success of our democracy, we need to raise our next generation to be both upstanding citizens and patriots who love their nation. From a young age, I've had the opportunity to learn the importance of patriotism and what it means to be an upstanding citizen through the Boy Scouts of America. To ensure that the next generation carries forward this respect for our nation, I believe the best asset we have is the history curriculum we teach in schools. And that is why this scavenger hunt is so important. It's not just a celebration of our nation's 250th birthday, but a structured experience that connects our 5th graders We're already learning about the American Revolution at school, to the rich local history and the legacies left behind by our very own Acton Minutemen. By teaching students about the events of the American Revolution while encouraging them to experience this history as if they were Acton Minutemen, we leverage the richness of the location we are so lucky to live in and make learning about the American Revolution an interactive and memorable experience. All around us are reminders of our revolutionary history, but many historical sites are not widely known. I hadn't fully realized how much history surrounds us in Acton with its numerous significant houses and figures. However, through the creation of this scavenger hunt, my eyes were opened to Acton's historical richness, and I hope to give this exact same experience to our fifth graders, as nothing makes you love your nation more than knowing that the men and women of your very own town had such a huge impact on the first few charges of the American Revolution, giving the United States the momentum it needed to eventually become sovereign and finally create the democracy we live in today. To conclude the scavenger hunt, all fifth graders who complete it will receive a 250 committee tricorn hat and be invited to march a section of the Isaac Davis Trail to Concord on April 19th, 2025, alongside the Acton Minutemen. They will be congratulated by a historical speaker at the end of the march. I'm very thrilled that the scavenger hunt is underway, and I'm grateful to everyone who helped make it happen, especially my history teacher, Ms. Maddox, who referred me to the 250 committee, Ms. Abrams and Mr. Light for helping make this activity happen at the elementary schools, and of course, for the 250 committee, who continue to organize and preserve the history of our town for us all to enjoy. It's my dream that for years to come, this scavenger hunt will continue to open the eyes of the next generation to the beauty and sacrifice that went into creating this nation. Thank you for listening.
I'm asking Ariane just to share the handout with people. I mean, they can just pass it among themselves, but this is really what they've created is quite something. Ariane, how many fifth graders are there in Acton? A couple hundred? Okay. There'll be a lot of scavengers out there. Okay. I realize I forgot to mention the 250 committee members who are here, like Pam Lynn, our history chair. Hi, Pam, raise your hand. Pam, raise your hand. And where's Bill Clower? Everybody in Acton should know Bill Clower, and they probably already do. I see Sue Peterman's there, does a lot of great graphic work. You already saw Steve. There's me. Oh, Ann Forbes is huge in the back there. She creates so much of what we do. Oh, am I missing anybody? And Brian McLean from Pine Hawk is our webmaster. What takes care? Who? Oh, and my name is Bob Ferrara. I thought I did that in the beginning, but okay. All right. Thank you for reminding me. Now my job is to let you know a little bit about our speaker, Daniel Mandell, Professor Daniel Mandell. The way Pam has structured our speakers, this Pam, we've more tried to follow the development back in the early 1770s, and our speakers have kind of gone along that path. We started with the Boston Tea Party, and then you get into 1774, a very difficult year, and that turns into something right at the end that was the Big Bang for us. But we've had a few speakers out of that sequence, and then this is one of them, because we wanted to focus on a group, in particular the Native Americans, who were still very much in this area, but were then coming back from a very difficult period, and more to come. So he's going to share with us what that dynamic was in their world. He's so ridiculously qualified to do this. He's got 6 books on the subject. I'm not going to read you all of them. And he's got a couple more really interesting ones, or at least one more about to come out again on a related subject. But he is a professor of history emeritus at Truman State University in Missouri. But he now lives in Worcester and occasionally teaches at WPI, Worcester Polytechnic. His most recent book, The Lost Tradition of Economic Equality in America, from 1600 to 1870, was just published in spring a few years ago. Since earning his PhD at the University of Virginia, a wonderful school for history majors, most of his research is focused on Native Americans in New England, thus producing those 6 books. I'm not going to read every one of them, but you can look at some of them in the back. The other kind of really wonderful thing about his background, he, for the Organization of American Historians, gave him the inaugural Lawrence Levine Award for the best book on American cultural history. So he's going to share a little cultural history with us now. Daniel?
Thank you. Yeah, I appreciate the invitation from Bob Ferreira, the Acton 250 committee and the Friends of Pine Hawk to come here, tell you about the experiences of Native Americans in southern New England before, during, and after the American Revolution. And thank you all for coming out on this not too cold December night. I'm going to be showing some slides, and you may want to come up forward. I don't know whether you'll be able to see the figures, because you'll see I've got charts and maps and such, and hopefully that will be large enough. At the end of the 1780s, a group of Mohegans in Connecticut bemoaned, I'm going to turn this off. Yeah, that's the problem, is feedback. Bemoaned that the times are exceedingly altered. Yea, the times have turned everything topside down. Why am I? Okay. This was certainly true for the indigenous peoples between the Appalachian Mountains and the Mississippi Valley. Okay, those folks, after a half century of war and displacement, then were hit by what we call the American Revolution, the War for Independence, and that turned out to be a high tide that concluded only with U.S. victory and the end of usefully competing European powers that put them at a strong disadvantage. But this was also true for Native Americans in southern New England, our region, whose ancestors a century earlier had survived the devastation of King Philip's War, 1675 to about 1677. Most Americans have heard about Crispus Attucks' death in the 1770 Boston Massacre, right? But few know about the thousands of Native Americans who lived in southern New England, their communities, and their challenges that they faced in the decades before the Revolution, their subsequent participation in the War for Independence, and then the significance for them after the war of what the Revolution had done to their communities. Now, New England Indian experiences during the Revolution and its aftermath were, not surprisingly, shaped by the unique conditions that had developed over the preceding century. So, I'll give here a brief overview, right? If you'd like more details, you can read my book, Behind the Frontier. Yes, it's for sale. There's also copies in various libraries in the area. About Native communities in eastern Massachusetts, right? If you want to read about those in Connecticut and Rhode Island during the same period, Linford Fisher's book, The Indians' Great Awakening, Connecticut and Rhode Island, is your best source. And if you're curious about the century previous to that, between the arrival of the English and King Philip's War, you can read another one of my books on King Philip's War. And then if you want to know more details about the century after the Revolution, there's my book, Tribe Race History. I love the cover photograph. You'll see this gentleman, Simon Johnson of Martha's Vineyard, the gay head community, later on in the slideshow. They'll recognize the boundaries, of course. As you can see, 1676 to 1776 is what this map covers. When we get to the end of the slideshow, you'll see another map, slightly larger, also shows the entire region. I hope you will notice that there are many fewer Native American communities, okay? Because one of the processes that's going on is that a lot of the smaller ones particularly are shrinking, and even by the end of the 18th century, they're vanishing altogether, or there are maybe one or two families seem to have vanished. And there's reasons for the dynamics of people moving to larger places and so on. That starts during the 17th century, all right? Accelerates during the 18th century, and then after the Revolution becomes a major trend. And so you wind up with just the larger native communities, particularly Mashpee here, of course, which is today federally recognized tribe on Cape Cod, and out here on Martha's Vineyard. It was called Gay Head at the time, i.e. 16th, 17th, 18th, 19th century. Today it's Aquinnah Gay Head. I refer to it in both ways. Narragansetts, they're still large in the 19th century, Mohegans and Pequots. There were some smaller communities that managed to hang on up here. Titicut, Matakeesit up there by Pembroke, Herring Pond, another small group, and that's pretty much it, okay? And you can see a bunch of others up there, Manamet and others that basically vanished by the time 1800 rolls along, Billingsgate, Manamoy, and others. And if you buy or read Behind the Frontier, this map is in it. Oops, too far. Okay, right. All right, so I'll have a population chart. You saw a glimpse of it in a moment. I'll get into it in more detail in a few minutes. You'll see that 7,000 Native Americans remained in the region after King Philip's War, okay, into 1700s. Most lived in their ancestral communities on land set aside under provincial law. And those laws in all three colonies dictated that lands could not be sold to outsiders without the permission of the colonial legislature. There are about 25 reservations, mostly along the coast. You may have noticed that from the map, ranging from about 100 to 4,000 acres. The largest were Mashpee and Gay Head. I went through all of that. These native groups managed the lands, timber, fish, and wildlife in common. These provided resources for baskets, crafts, and medicines, peddled, sold often by women to neighboring white communities. But economic and cultural changes were underway during the 1700s, often driven by ecological shifts, as pressure from neighboring white settlers tended to use up resources, so that you started to see households, native households, embracing Anglo-American farming techniques, raising cattle, fencing in allotted fields, which their children could inherit, but it could not be passed on to outsiders or sold to outsiders. By 1720s, most lived in cabins, not in wigwams. That's again because the ecology of the region started changing, and the materials they needed to build the wigwams were becoming scarce. In fact, wigwams became kind of curiosities when this is sketches from Ezra Stiles' sketchbook in the early 1700s. He sketched out some of the wigwams that he found, as well as making, jotting down some information about the people who were living there. The outside income became necessary to obtain clothing, tools, and other goods. Because that income was needed, men often left, serving in colonial militia during the early 18th century wars in Maine, ironically, against Wabanaki peoples. And then as the whaling trade emerged in southern New England, many of them became sought-after seamen on those whaling voyages. You may be thinking of Moby Dick. Good. That's some of the people you run into in Moby Dick are examples of that. In these wars and on the whaling trade, some of them disappeared for years. Some of them disappeared forever and died. And that left an imbalance between men and women that left women increasingly in an important role managing the community resources, community lands. But even the women sometimes had to leave the community to find work as domestics in neighboring towns, seaports, and so on. They would return at regular intervals, although some did stay in those towns and made their homes there. So you just have Native Americans showing up in towns like Plymouth, Barnstable, and others, and finding a place to work, a place to live. Native peoples during the 18th century faced other challenges. The colonists enslaved many Native peoples in the wake of King Philip's War. They kept some here. They sent many to the West Indies to work to their death in the growing sugar plantations. Native children were indentured as household servants, usually till adulthood, although sometimes they were kept on in forced labor afterwards. The problem with that is that it kind of accelerated the decline of indigenous languages because they were being raised with English only in English households. That also tended to shatter kinship networks and create problems for many of these communities. After 1700, increasing numbers of enslaved African American, mainly African rather, men, mostly men, because they were being sought after for labor, were brought into the colonies, including New England, where a noticeable number met and married Native women. So we have one example here, actually. This is Paul Cuffey. Actually fairly prominent. Has anyone heard of Paul Cuffey? Good, right? What do you know about Paul Cuffey? Ship captain and Quaker. Yeah, ship captain, Quaker, extremely prominent man. He is the son of a marriage between Ruth Moses, a Wampanoag woman living in Dartmouth, and Coffee, an Ashanti from West Africa, who had been brought enslaved to Rhode Island about 1720. Gained his freedom in the mid-1740s. They married in 1747 and produced a number of children, including Paul here. They settled in Dartmouth, buying a 116-acre farm. And that's where the family made their home. However, they maintained connections with Ruth Moses's relatives out on the islands, including the Gayhead community on Martha's Vineyard, where they spent many summers. So they summered on Martha's Vineyard. Isn't that wonderful? During the Revolution, Paul here, an adult and a mariner by then, went off on a whaling trip, was captured by the British at sea, spent 3 months in a British prison, was released, came back, and then began to gain his wealth and his influence by smuggling goods into Nantucket during the war. So there you have an example of a part Native American who played a significant role as a civilian, if you will, in the war smuggling goods, as a lot of people did. Paul became a wealthy captain, ship owner, and leader of the initial black-led Back to Africa movement. Made a number of voyages to West Africa with people who wanted to go there, right? That was before Southern plantation owners took control of the movement and turned it into something else. His brother, he had a number of brothers. David helped him smuggle, and Jonathan. Jonathan went in a different direction. By 1795, Jonathan had moved to Gayhead and became a recognized member of the community, signing petitions along with other natives from the community. And they actually, Paul and Jonathan maintained their connection so that when the Gayhead natives needed some help, they sometimes asked Paul to step in. So these connections, even though clearly you can see from the outline he looks African, there is this clear connection and heritage that remain part of the family. In fact, Paul himself married a woman named Alice Pequot. And I've heard maybe she was Pequot, maybe she was Wampanoag, but it's worth noting, first of all, Paul never moved to Africa. Maybe that's the wife's influence. And they had at least one son, Paul Jr., who later wrote an autobiography titled The Autobiography of Paul Cuffey, a Pequot, Paul Cuffey Jr., a Pequot. So there you go. Marriage with outsiders sometimes became the focus of community conflicts. This happened among the Mohegans, among the Narragansetts, two of the larger southern New England Native communities, where the language of race by the 1770s was used by reformers like Samson Occom, you'll meet him in a moment, who blamed these newcomers for things going wrong within their communities. Anglo-Americans began to perceive Indians as blacks or mulattoes. And more about that later, because it becomes kind of an increasing development at the end of the century when there's more marriages between Native women and African-American men in particular. Provincial officials increasingly interfered in Native communities. That's those guardians. By the mid-18th century, all three colonial assemblies assigned guardians, 1 to 3, to each group to manage resources, labor contracts, and take care of other legal concerns. Although some guardians could be helpful, often these men proved contempt abusers of natives and their resources, committing fraud and other problems that the Indian communities fought back against with petitions and other measures, which I'll describe in a bit. But first, take a look at the population figures. I hope you can see these figures. There are 3 censuses from the 1765, that's Massachusetts, and then there's 2 from Connecticut and Rhode Island, 1774. They're fairly accurate. There's some patterns you can see. First of all, notice, by the way, I've got Acton up here, 608 people, whites lived in Acton. Those are whites identified in the census as whites of all ages and all genders. 608. There was 1 black male and 2 black females, and no Native Americans identified as such in Acton in 1765. Boston had obviously much higher numbers, but one pattern that I think is kind of fascinating is that you can see the population totals are much higher in the coastal towns, right? Plymouth County, Barnstable County, Bristol County. Compare that to Middlesex County, right? The totals are much higher along the coast, and that is true, by the way, of Native American communities as well, identified here along the coast. One difference that I noticed between Connecticut and Rhode Island, and during the 18th century I'm more familiar with what happens in Massachusetts, is that if you can see the figures, you'll notice that there are many more, in many of these Native communities, like Gay Head, which is kind of part of the town of Chilmark, right? Gay Head on Dukes County, Martha's Vineyard towards the bottom, about 5 lines up. There's 116 Indian females and 72 Indian males. That's because many of the men had been killed in the colonial wars or had vanished on the whaling voyages, and so you had this demographic imbalance, and that was particularly apparent in Massachusetts in 1765. Native Americans also had continued problems with epidemics. That was perhaps most noticeable. You can see Nantucket on Sherburne, 3rd line up from the bottom. From Massachusetts, 66 females and 83 men. Those are much smaller numbers than there would have been in 1760 because there was an epidemic that hit just the natives on the island, 1763, 1764, blamed at the time on yellow fever, probably not, for various circumstances I don't want to get into now, but that epidemic killed 222 of the approximately 360 natives living on the island at the time, just in that one winter. So this continued to be a problem. That is Sampson Occam, by the way. In eastern Massachusetts, in the wake of King Philip's War, one of the things that developed were these native-led churches in the native communities. These were ministers, native ministers, who played significant influences in native communities, putting together these churches, often becoming the glue that brought together scattered families into larger communities. It's played a very significant role. Natives in Connecticut and Rhode Island, on the other hand, like the Narragansetts and the Pequots, generally resisted the few feeble missionary efforts during the 18th century, during the 17th century, until the early 1740s. If you've heard of the Great Awakening, that is when Native Americans in Connecticut and Rhode Island embraced Christianity, a particular evangelical version of Christianity that became widespread during the Great Awakening would play a role in the rising Baptist denomination. Initially, the revival was welcomed by everyone in the region, but then educated ministers and elites felt besieged by the enthusiasts. There's some pretty interesting scenes being described during this period, and that included Native Americans, sailors, African Americans, the lower sort, as they were called at the time. Native Americans in Connecticut and Rhode Island embraced this faith that seemed to reform their often abusive white neighbors, and that seemed to emphasize an emotional release from the oppression that they felt. In 1746, the growing Narragansett and Pequot congregation rejected their white minister, built a meeting house on the Narragansett Reserve, and ordained their own, a man named Samuel Niles, as a minister. At the same time, Native students began graduating from a kind of more orthodox school, the Eleazar Wheelock's Little Red School. That may ring a bell with some people in Connecticut. And one of those graduates, in fact, was the Mohegan man here, Samson Occam, who became quite well known, not only in Northeast America, but even in England in the 1760s. He went on a fundraising trip for the school through England, gathering funds, and was written about in newspapers, and portrait was made of him, and so on. Became a very, very prominent man. And he and Samuel Niles became leaders in the growing opposition against the increasingly corrupt traditional sachems within their communities, who were selling tribal lands to white elites. And you're probably too far away to see this petition, so I'll just describe it. Because Indians were socially and politically marginalized in provincial New England, they weren't part of the plotting or pamphleteering that began to emerge in the 1760s, driving the revolts against imperial rule that would erupt in the War for Independence in 1775. But natives did make their own efforts to secure life, liberty, and property, ironically, by petitioning King George for relief from oppressive provincial legislatures, corrupt guardians, and malicious white neighbors. And here you have the text of a letter, a petition brought by Reuben Cognahue of Mashpee. He was a school teacher in Mashpee. He was actually a Mohegan himself. That gives you a sense of how natives were traveling between communities, right? Massachusetts legislature imposed guardianships on the Indian communities within the colony, 1746. Mashpee hated it right from the beginning. And they were constantly asking the legislature, petition the legislature, get rid of these guardians. They're giving away our lands. They're allowing whites to strip our timber. We don't want them. They did not get relief. They were largely ignored, so they sent schoolmaster Robin Cognahue to London to present a petition to the king in 1760. This is some of the text from that petition. It was actually quite an epic journey. If you could read this, they got he went on a vessel ready to sail from Rhode Island. The ship was shipwrecked on the coast of Hispaniola. The petitioner was taken off of the ship, put into, impressed on one of the ship of war into the Royal Navy, but he managed to persuade the captain that he was on this important mission, and so the captain let him get off in London and take the petition to the king. Presented the petition to the King's Council. The Council's Board of Trade told Massachusetts Governor Francis Bernard to require the legislature to answer the Mashpee's complaint. 3 years later, Mashpee finally won the right to choose their own selectmen. So they won, although 2 of the 5 selectmen had to be Anglo-Americans, but the natives had a majority on the Board of Selectmen. Far less effort was a similar effort by Chappaquiddick. That's the native community on the east side, of Martha's Vineyard. which for years had been abused and swindled by their guardians and white neighbors. Their complaints gained some sympathy and hearing, but no relief, so they tried following the same thing that Mashpee had done in 1773. They dug into their pockets to send a delegate to London. Unfortunately, while the king was happy to order Massachusetts to do something about this, of course, by that point, the colony was basically in revolt against the king's rule anyway, so it amounted to nothing. The Narragansetts followed a similar course. Earlier, 1768, they had been trying to get rid of their traditional sachem, but the Rhode Island Assembly refused to withdraw its support of the sachem. So that tribe sent two delegates, Tobias and John Shattuck Jr., to London to petition the king for relief. Unfortunately, nothing came of that, and in fact, Tobias died in 1768 of smallpox in Edinburgh, so that was unsuccessful. Similarly, the Mohegans had this very long effort to reclaim lands that they felt their first sachem, Uncas, had never given to anyone. And this went on from the early 1700s through several iterations. Finally, in 1771, just to cut the description short, in 1771, the King's Council did set up a court in London to hear the case. The court heard the case, ruled against the Mohegans and for the colony of Connecticut. And in 1772, they reconfirmed that ruling, pretty much ending the case. This verdict was the proverbial final straw that drove reformists in Connecticut, Rhode Island, and eastern Long Island to establish a multi-tribal Christian Indian settlement outside of New England. That would later be known as the Brotherton Settlement, or Brothertown Settlement. The idea took hold in March 1773, and here you can see the letter that the group were meeting together, Mashantucket and Stonington Pequots, Narragansetts, Montauks from eastern Long Island, Farmingtons, also known as the Tunxus Indians living near Farmington, Connecticut, and Mohegans. So there were 7 representatives from 7 groups met together and agreed to create a new community far from New England and sent out a letter to their communities asking for their support. In the fall of 1773, they gained the support of Sir William Johnson, who was the Crown's Indian Superintendent for Northern Colonies. And in 1774, the Mohegan preacher Joseph Johnson and other delegates met with the Oneidas. That's one of the 6 Haudenosaunee or Iroquois nations out in New York, what's now New York, right? Met with the Oneidas after Joseph Johnson gave a speech denouncing the wrongs done to them by English colonists. The Oneida spokesman replied favorably to the request, granting them land on which to settle, and embraced as their brethren these 7 New England Indian communities. Now, Occam, Johnson, and their allies must have been torn over how to manage now that there was this increasing conflict between the American colonists and the imperial authorities. They'd fought in various wars alongside the colonists. They lived among the colonists, but had good reasons because of the support given to their enterprise by Crown officials to support the Crown. And there were comments by various members, Occam's brother-in-law, so on, saying, you know, it's the Europeans, the imperial officials who are giving us support, and we should not turn against you. And as a result, perhaps, the situation became dangerous for them because the colonists were beginning to see them as agents of the Crown. So they're kind of caught in the middle at that point. But at this point, leaders of the Brothertown movement, including Joseph Johnson and another gentleman, Elijah Wampy, agreed on behalf of the colonists to work for the colonists as diplomats with the 6 nations. The Americans needed allies, needed native allies. At the very least, they wanted to make sure that the very powerful 6 nations did not immediately join the imperial armies against the colonists, against the colonial effort. In June 1775, the Oneidas agreed to be neutral, but the Americans wanted stronger support. So in February 1776, the Mohegan Joseph Johnson actually went to Washington's encampment in Cambridge, where he was commissioned by General Washington to go to the Six Nations, and ultimately the Oneidas, and he persuaded the Oneidas to become active allies of the Americans. Unfortunately, the total number, now here I start talking about the native, yes?
Where was Brotherton?
Brotherton winds up it's out in New York. It's in Oneida Reservation territory, right in the middle of upstate New York. It's not there anymore, of course. It's actually out in Wisconsin now. It's a federally recognized tribe up in the Wisconsin Peninsula. It's the Brotherton, Stockbridge, it's connected with, I don't know if it's actually called Brothertown. It's the Stockbridge Munsee Indians, right? I don't think Brothertown has federal recognition, but things get mixed up during the 19th century out there.
So it was really de facto a reservation.
No, Brotherton was actually a town. Brotherton is a town that is established after the Revolution, after the war stops, right? So you get, and this is actually a point I was going to get to later, you get these migrants from these 7 tribes who go out to Oneida territory. It's not a reservation. It's land that they hold by treaty and tradition and all this at the time. 1780s, 1790s, they settle a town, and the town is called Brothertown. Samson Occam is one of the officials in the town and so on. And the town operates for quite a while, a number of decades before they're basically forced to move from white pressure. Does that answer your question?
Yeah. I mean, the Indians were screwed from day one. And I guess, I'm kind of curious because it looks like there were educated people among the Indians.
Oh yeah, they're highly educated.
There's no law in the colony saying you can't teach people how to read and write.
Say again?
There's no law, like I know it was forbidden to educate slaves.
Actually, at least not in Massachusetts. In fact, in Massachusetts, there was enslaved Africans were expected to learn to read the Bible, right? So it was in the South that education was banned, but not in New England. So that was never an issue. But why don't I go on and, okay. The records generally are pretty bad, frankly. They're confusing and incomplete. When names that are clearly natives do appear in the enlistment records, that gets confusing too because they appear many times over. For example, there's 7 distinct John Wampys, Wampys, in the Connecticut records. And so it's really almost impossible to tell how many people served in the war. And then a lot of times, actually, individuals were not identified in the records. And we only know about them because later on, at the end of the 19th century, local historians would write about them. So we have these local histories that talk about particular individuals and their stories and all this. So this is oral history that gets recorded later on in these town histories published in the late 19th, early 20th century. These were not segregated military units, by the way. In fact, the U.S. military, the colonial militia, well, the state militia, they're now states, 1776, they're states. The militia and the Continental Army was not segregated. You get mixed units. That'll be the last war until the Korean War, that we don't have segregated military. And just an example of how the local records, the military records don't quite match up with how much you can get out of town histories. Ledyard in Connecticut, the minister John Avery wrote a town history in 1901, and in that he reported that there were 5 members of the Comwas family, Pequots, who were killed during the Revolution. but that name does not appear on any list of Connecticut soldiers. So I think it's oral history. It's particularly unfortunate that there are so few surviving ship crew lists, right? There just aren't, because Indian men commonly worked as mariners before the war and would have naturally found it more appealing to enlist in the Navy. There are even fewer crew lists from privateers, right? These were ships that were licensed to go out and prey on English and enemy shipping. And there was pretty good money to be made if you survived on these ships. And so just naturally you'd expect Native Americans and African Americans too to serve on those kinds of vessels, but we have no crew lists, or very few, just a handful. So again, there's a big question mark on a lot of this. Still, what can be known is impressive. Perhaps the most prominent example is the Stockbridge Indian Company, a separate company, independent, in the Continental Army. Stockbridge was settled in the 1730s by Mohicans along the Housatonic River, and I don't have a lot of time to give you the details, but they were kind of distinct in various ways from natives further to the east in southern New England, those communities. Their connections were more towards natives up along the upper Connecticut River, and then farther out west and down towards the Ohio Valley, which actually made them very valuable allies in the 7 Years' War. A number of them served in Rogers Rangers during the 7 Years' War. A week before Lexington and Concord, they sent word to the Massachusetts Congress that they would fight for the province as a unit. Unfortunately, when Washington put the company into his line alongside his other units at White Plains, New York, in August 1778, they were surrounded by Hessians, and one of the Hessian officers actually drew this, made an ink drawing of one of the Stockbridge Indian soldiers, right? And a lot of them were killed. 32 did survive to the end of the war, however. And when they returned home, they actually found a large number of those migrants from Connecticut and Rhode Island Native communities who had gone out to settle this new Brotherton community, but the war had created such disorder, such problems, such threats, that they went to nearby Stockbridge, which was just, a day's journey to the east, and spent the rest of the war there. But all of the natives in Stockbridge, Brotherton, and Stockbridge, the Stockbridge Mohicans themselves, were increasingly outnumbered and marginalized by their white neighbors, and soon, 1780s, 1790s, they all migrated to Oneida, and then later on kept moving west. From Connecticut, about 75 native soldiers and sailors can be clearly identified as Indian. About 30 Mohegans served, including Reuben Cognahue, who returned home to Mohegan and signed up in the Connecticut line. 2 of Samson Occam's nephews and his brother Jonathan. At least 17 died, including all the sons of Samuel Ashbow, an interpreter and preacher. One of them, Samuel Jr., died at the Battle of Bunker Hill. Rebecca Tanner, again a Mohegan, already a widow before the war, lost 4 sons, all of her children, as did Marcy Uncas, Mohegan. At least 15 Pequots died in the American Army, 9 in 1776 and 6 in 1778. Another, John Wampy, survived, one of those 7 John Wampys, survived the Battle of Bunker Hill, although he lost his weapon in the battle. From Derby, farther to the west, Joseph Maui, leader of a small native community, is said to have fought in the Revolution. Soon after the war erupted, his daughter Eunice married John Sutnux, a Narragansett. Sutnux then joined the Continental Line and fought at Saratoga. He survived, and after the war, they all moved out to Schaghticoke, what's Connecticut, the town of Kent today in Connecticut, out on the western side. Our state, many men, Indian men in Massachusetts, joined the American forces right from the start. Thomas Cognahue, a cousin of Reuben, who who lived in Sandwich, joined the town's militia responding to the Concord alarm on April 19th. About 20 Natick Indians fought for the independence, including a gentleman named Caesar Ferret, who was age 55, right, grabbed a musket, and his son John, who were among the town's Minutemen who got to Concord in time to fire at the retreating British troops. And in December 1776, those two went on with Washington's forces to reinforce New York City. While only a few Native men remained in Punkapog, modern-day Stoughton, Canton, right? Another early praying town, a local historian noted that 7 Mohu brothers faithfully served their country during the Revolution. Those were his words. Nipmucks, that's our territory, between Worcester and Providence, down towards Providence, also fought for the Revolution. At least 3 were from Grafton. Joseph Aaron, who was 40 years old when he enlisted in 1778. Andrew Brown, who was later remembered as a, quote, tall Indian with straight black hair, enlisted in the Leicester Regiment in June 1775 and was subsequently wounded and lamed. Fortune Burney Jr. was one of the Grafton Minutemen in April 19th. A week later, joined the Army, but then deserted in September 1776 and was never heard from again. At least a dozen other Nipmucks living in towns along the Connecticut-Massachusetts border also served in the war, some from Massachusetts, some for Connecticut lines. Actually, some of them went from a Connecticut force, and when his enlistment was off, went to the Massachusetts force. I don't know why, that just happened. Mashpee, like other native groups in the region, had suffered terribly from the French and Indian War. A lot of the men had been killed, right? In 1776, about a third of the households were headed by widows, just to give you a sense. Yet they showed remarkable support for the revolution. 10 days after the Declaration of Independence was published, their white minister, Gideon Hawley, wrote, quote, several of my Indians lately returned from sea have enlisted in the continental or provincial service and had joined the expedition to Canada. At the end of the year, he reported that about 10 had enlisted in the Continental Line, and more had joined the militia and Navy. And here I do have enlistment records from the Barnstable, the 1st Barnstable Regiment, that show at least 20 enlisted in that regiment and remained when it became, in June 1777, the 1st Regiment in the Continental Army. The Indian communities in Bristol and Plymouth County had shrunk by the mid-18th century, but there too, many men served. And I'm going to kind of skip over the names and the numbers. Just take it from me, there were a few dozen. And Rhode Island. Rhode Island's published records are probably the worst. Their published records only show the names of officers in their regiments, and none of those, of course, were Native Americans or people of color. I actually recently found some records in the National Archives, and I need to go through those and see if any of those are Narragansetts. But we do know from other kinds of records that a lot of Narragansetts did serve in the war, did serve in the American military. There's actually some pretty colorful incidents of what some of them did. So while the incomplete data bars a meaningful analysis of the numbers or percentage, the evidence points to high participation. So that's kind of the bottom line. Not surprisingly, wartime losses, now I'm going to the post-war period, quickly. Wartime turmoil and losses wreaked havoc on these Native communities who had already been suffering from declining numbers, poverty, and racism. After the war, New England generally was hit by the Depression. They were now cut out of the British imperial system, had to pay taxes and so on, tariffs, had to pay tariffs if they wanted to engage in trade or smuggle. Widowhood left many women destitute and forced many of those to sell the remaining lands to pay debts and to buy food. In response to these wartime problems and post-war problems, a noticeable number of Indians sought a better life elsewhere. Some became homeless, like the eight Native women who in 1806 sought help from the state legislature, saying that because their men had died in the war, they needed assistance. The largest post-war immigration went to Brotherton. And you actually can see, if you could see this chart, and this is in my Tribe Race History book, you would see that the number of Mohegan and Narragansett populations shrink dramatically between 1780 and 1815. That's the third set. That's because the people are moving out. A lot of them are moving out to Brotherton. Now again, particular figures are problematic because of the sources. While some of the data does come from Native letters and petitions to legislatures, so we have names and numbers from those. Censuses and records of birth and death were kept by Anglo-Americans, who tended to ignore marginalized families moving around, regardless of race, or residing on a town's outskirts, and of course, many of those people were people of color, including Indians. Here's that larger map I had mentioned. There are fewer Native communities, and what the big picture within southern New England is that many natives are moving from isolated hamlets or Anglo-American villages, which increasingly are dominating these really small hamlets, to one of the larger reserves. The Mashpee Reserve out on Cape Cod was particularly attractive. Censuses in the 1790s identified immigrants from Nantucket, Mohegan, Narragansett, Nantucket, Martha's Vineyard, and a lot of the hamlets that you would have seen on the 1775 map. Many moved to cities and growing towns. Some Nipmucks settled in Worcester, including Nipmuc, Hassanamisco Nipmuc, that's modern-day Grafton, right, was the praying town of Hassanamisco, was a Nipmuc community, and from there Samuel Bowman settled in Worcester, and his granddaughter, Hepzibah Hemingway, this is a portrait painted of her, one of the few portraits we have of Native Americans this early. It was painted in the 1830s. She married an African-American carpenter and became a very well-known baker within the well, it was still a town, but call it a city, of Worcester. Also quite prominent in this, in this human movement was movement to Native communities of African-American men who would then marry Native women. For example, after the Revolution, Seneca Boston, African-American, met and married one of the surviving Wampanoag women on Nantucket. And a few years later, they welcomed a son, Absalom Boston, this man, who rose to become a prominent innkeeper and ship's captain on the island, captained an all-black whaling crew, one of the few at the time. This is from the 1840s, this portrait was made. Every Anglo-American observer after the war noted the rising tide of intermarriage, and given the increasing influence at the time of scientific racism, they concluded that few real Indians were remaining, and that Native communities and Native people generally would soon become extinct, which of course did not happen. While Indians themselves knew that these newcomers offered new skills and connections, the newcomers may have aided some post-war changes, particularly the growth of the Baptist and Methodist denominations at Mashpee and Gay Head, which quickly outnumbered the more orthodox congregations, and possibly the more rapid disappearance of native languages, because after all, the newcomers did not speak native languages, and the children that they raised often were not raised with the languages, less likely to learn. Yet, these human movements seem to have had fairly few effects on Indian economies. And obviously, this is a map of Mashpee. And if you could take a close look at this map, you'd see that there's salt marshes, there's good places to catch fish in these ponds, there's good clamming, outstanding clamming, and there's woods where you can kill deer. Okay, so it's got a little bit of everything, and it's a cornucopia for Native people. Native communities like Mashpee maintained a mixed subsistence economy, hunting and sheep and cattle raising, fishing, communal resource management, and landholding as families and severalty. The allotments could be passed on to children, but if the children died, then it went back to the community. We were never sold to outsiders. The lands of pastures, woods, and fishing grounds continued to be maintained in common. There was actually one exception to this rule in May 1789. That quote I started with, the Mohegan people saying the world had been turned upside down. That was part of a petition where they were asking the Connecticut legislature to divide their lands in severalty, i.e. among families, to be held forever legally. That's because they feared that some of their members had become too greedy and were starting to amass large amounts of land and large farms, and they wanted each of them to have a certain amount that they could depend on. But a lot of those people who had been trying to amass the land as part of the reform movement, reform in quotes, like Samson Occam was accused of doing, they all moved to Brotherton. And so by the Civil War, that division had pretty much been forgotten, and they were just back to the way they had always used land before. Indians also left their communities to work as farm laborers or domestics in Anglo-American households, as before the war. And this is actually from a book published in 1855, Nonantum and Natick. Talking about, the text is talking about an 1848 study of Native Americans in New England, in Massachusetts rather, but I love the drawing from the chapter front piece. These are native basket weavers who appeared from other places who came to Natick and to other communities to sell their baskets. So we have this kind of evidence, and actually Henry David Thoreau describes some of these traveling basket sellers as well. Alfred Bierstadt painted one, Martha Simon, who lived near Dartmouth down in Massachusetts. So they're definitely prominent in the land. While apprenticeships and other forms of indentures after the Revolution declined among Anglo-Americans, they continued to be used against Indians and African Americans. It was kind of a social control. So that involuntary servitude continued to be a problem. And Native women also continued to go to nearby communities to work as domestics. For the men, a lot of them continued to go off whaling. And this is that picture of Simon Johnson wearing whalers' clothes, whaling men's clothes. He was a deacon in the Gayhead community, a fairly prominent man. This is an early tintype, a wonderful photograph. By 1800, visitors to communities like Mashpee, Gayhead reported that there were only young boys and elderly men at home in the communities. The rest were all out whaling. Deep water whaling took Indian men far from their villages and made them actually part of the international maritime culture. On ships, they served, like Moby Dick, right? They served along Anglo-American men. They drank too much, just like the Anglo-American sailors did. This kind of stereotype tends to be, how Indians are depicted, but it's true of seafaring Anglo-American men as well. In the wake of the war, nearly all the Indian communities in the region were assigned guardians by state legislature, again. In some cases, this was at the request of the Native communities who asked for help. But interestingly, at this point after the war, the Native communities insisted that they play a role in deciding who those guardians were going to be, that the guardians were their agents, not that of the legislature. While the Mashpees, as I'd already noted, fought alongside their white neighbors for liberty and independence, the upheaval of the Revolution, this is Reverend Gideon, their white minister, Reverend Gideon Hawley, who started there in the 1750s, and he's still there after the war. And the upheaval of that war hardened his belief in the need for hierarchy, the need for order. So the minister, like others in the region, was shocked when Shays' Rebellion erupted, just 3 years after the end of the war, especially as it seemed a broader political and social movement that drew considerable support from many towns in Barnstable County, including Mashpee, including Hawley's own Sandwich. He lived in the town of Sandwich nearby, and there was a lot of support for Shays' Rebellion. It was in that atmosphere that the minister asked the legislature in 1788 for tighter control of Mashpee to appoint guardians, to take away their elected selectmen and to appoint instead guardians. And finally, in 1789, the year after that, the legislature did so, and of course, actually included Hawley on the list of guardians. And in fact, Hawley became the appointed treasurer for the Mashpee district, which drove the natives crazy. In June 1791, and I'm kind of towards the tail end now, this is 1791, 21 Mashpees demanded that the state restore, this is the words from their petition, the old Constitution and our liberty. And they told the legislature they never wanted to hear Hawley preach again, or even to see his face in our place anymore. Again, that's from the petition. Hawley successfully fought off this challenge, blaming the protests on a few disorderly men. After a second petition, 1 year later, was similarly rejected by the legislature, the Mashpees hired a lawyer who drew up a wonderful petition connecting the Indians' love of freedom and wartime sacrifices with America's revolutionary ideals. Soon, religion became part of the growing conflict. This is as that petition was being drawn up. An ordained native Baptist minister, Thomas Jeffers, moved to the community. So Hawley in his reply, blamed the growing hostility on outsiders, quote, this is from his reply, preaching up the doctrines of liberty and equality among the Indians to bring them to their side in politics and to the Baptist side in religion. In June 1796, the largest ever numbers of Mashpees signed another petition, rejecting Hawley because they said they'd become Baptists. And again, drawing on revolutionary ideals of equality and liberty and freedom. But the minister again managed to persuade the legislatures that the Mashpees were incompetent and without his oversight would become easy prey for fraud and trespass. And so not until 1834 would the Mashpees regain their autonomy. And by then, Hawley had died. He died in 1807. No doubt the effects of Mashpee and other native groups to regain autonomy had roots in native resistance to colonial oppression. And Whig rhetoric, radical rhetoric of rights and liberties, had little meaning before the 1770s. Yet, that's not that different from the vast majority of Anglo-Americans, right? Even the people of Concord, where the war began, remained distanced from the ideological contest taking place in Boston until the Massachusetts Government Act of 1774. But once the war began, even the nearly illiterate Anglo-American lower sort recognized and embraced the upheaval's revolutionary promise. A promise that they continue to seek after the war's end. And this is what Native experience illustrates. The Mashpee efforts are part of the larger picture of how Americans fought during the early republic to either contain or attain the promise of the revolution. Their use of radical Whig language was not simply an effort to manipulate the white man's ideas. These ideas had powerful meanings, particularly in a community like Mashpee, where many had fought and suffered for the patriot cause. Their struggles are a remarkable illustration of how subaltern peoples, people below, lower sort, were as much a part of the revolutionary process as Anglo-American elites. This also supports the view, by the way, that religious dissent was part of America's democratic revolution. More generally, this process highlights how the revolution was a political and a social process that began before the war, continued into the early national period, and held different meanings for different groups. The war clearly affected Indians in southern New England. Native communities seemed to feel more pressure on their land and other resources, in part due to the increased needs and decline of deference among the surrounding white population. All lost many men, some replaced in part by intermarriage with outsiders, especially African Americans. But most of these problems were intensifications and continuations of long-term developments. Smaller Indian groups in the region were already shrinking by 1750. Indian communities continued even as more men left on whaling voyages to feature a mixed subsistence economy and the need to protect family, community, and turf from aggressive whites. While the revolution may have been what some thought caused everything to be turned topside down, for natives, that was true of the entire century. Thus, ironically, the emergence and spread of democratic ideology may have been the biggest change of the revolution for natives in southern New England. Thank you.
We have time for a handful of questions. Well, people think of any. I wanted to ask one that's kind of a toughie. The pressures on these people were just enormous. I mean, the jobs had to go. All right, we'll try this.
We'll try this, and I'll get this. I'll turn this off.
The pressures on the Native Americans were just intense. For oh, we got a feedback. Okay, so you had, for starting a little before the time period you talked about, we had these enormous diseases that in some cases knocked out 90% of the population. And then they're coming back and build up a little King Philip's War. And then it starts, that whole, that started all this period that you talked about. Could you give us a sense of, we have 10,000 years of pretty good history for the Native Americans, and we're coming up to what did the population curve look like? I mean, it just felt like they got decimated 2 or 3 times.
Yeah. Clearly, 1630, natives are obviously the majority. The English arrive, and in 1620, 1630, you get more coming. But when does the majority in southern New England become, the modern geographic region? Right, southern New England, Connecticut, Rhode Island, Massachusetts. When does it become majority of English as opposed to native? There's so many things that remain unknown, but I would hazard a guess it would be maybe 1650, 1660, around there, something like that. Then, of course, you get King Philip's War, which proportionally actually was the most, was the highest proportion of casualties in any American wars relative to the population, right? So the English suffered too. They had to abandon a lot of the towns that they had established between, say, 1630 and 1675. They abandoned and did not resettle until after 1715. For Native Americans, of course, they're shattered in terms of the population. Of course, many of them are killed. A lot of them left the region, heading out west, heading north. But then you get thousands, 5,000, 6,000 who stay, who remain in the region. And they suffer disease, but they do okay, right? That's the amazing part. Despite all of these problems, these threats, they're in their home territory. And while they face problems and continued pressure on resources that kind of just keeps ratcheting up and ratcheting up and ratcheting up, they manage. I guess that's the amazing part. And the same thing happens after the war, although again, a large number leave, many die, they go to Brotherton, some of them, and many of them start moving to the cities. They remain, and a lot of them become part of the growing cities. And actually, there's this linkage that develops. A lot of many native individuals and families move to like Worcester and Boston and Plymouth. This is after the American Revolution, and they move and become part of African American communities. So you get the Hemingways that have these connections to both the African American communities. They're part of, by the time you get to the early 19th century, they belong to African American churches. And they identify in that way. Some of the men actually enlist in the 54th Massachusetts, the Civil War force, right? But at the same time, some of them maintain these connections to their native people, so that a census made by John Milton Earl for the state in 1859, I talk a lot about that in Tribe Race History, showed a number of Hemingways in the Worcester area. And that's part of this story. They're not isolated. They create and foster these links. So I don't know if that answers your question, but completely.
That certainly helps. What a resilient group they are.
Yeah.
Now,
yeah.
Steve has a microphone in the back if others want to ask some questions. And when we're done, I would remind everybody that there's books for sale, and Ann Forbes has a bunch of interesting things to look at, so people could look around there as well. But any other questions out there? Steve, over there.
Hi. So this wasn't the lecture I was expecting, and forgive me, I don't know why I was expecting an Indigenous speaker tonight. And I was expecting something based on my experience when I went to Haudenosaunee Welcome Center in New York, near Oneida, and their take on the American Revolution was, look what we did, not with the revolution, but with the idea of democracy. And they described how the members of the Continental Congress lived near indigenous communities, and some of the ideas for governance of the new country came from the indigenous community. And I know this is outside your geographic area of expertise. I'd love to hear your take on that. Is it revisionist history? Is it?
No, it's actually. Can you repeat the question a little bit?
Yeah.
It's hard to.
The question is whether this. It's not universally embraced by Haudenosaunee people, but one of the kind of why I'm going to call it a myth. Not myths. Not all myths are completely untrue, right? There are myths that have roots in things, beliefs that actually happened, right? I'm calling it a myth because it's contested, heavily contested. It's actually the myth that I'm describing, just to give it a label, is that the Constitution in particular, that's often singled out, but generally what we identify as many American ideas about democracy came from Haudenosaunee traditions and Haudenosaunee ways of doing things, of politics and so on, right? I'm summarizing it fairly accurately. And they point out that when in the so-called Albany Congress, 1754, there were Haudenosaunee people there as observers, and they said, gee, we're united, why don't you guys unite? And then Benjamin Franklin, there was connections between the constitutional Assembly 1787 in Philadelphia, and Haudenosaunee people, and also Delaware natives as well often visited Philadelphia, communicated with Franklin and others, all kinds of communication going on, right? So they tend to emphasize that communication. That understanding is contested by most historians who study that period, okay, the ideas. In fact, I'll just say that actually, that's one of the few topics that I've heard caused a fistfight at a scholarly conference, because both sides felt very strongly about their side of this. My own take is that, frankly, you look at the language, you look at the Haudenosaunee, the Confederation was made up of what was a council that met at various points. It was never, there wasn't a particular, it's not like every year it would meet. So whenever there's a problem, it would meet, right? And there were each nation, there were 5 to start with, and then a 6th. Of the 5 nations, each had a certain number of delegates to the Confederation, all right? And the council would meet, and they would discuss. That kind of sounds similar, right? But here are the differences between that and, say, the United States Congress. Differences are, the offices were hereditary. That is, the names of the offices were passed on, and the people who held those offices, the individual men, were not elected by people in their villages. They were actually chosen by elderly women, as the Haudenosaunee were a matrilineal community where the elderly women made a lot of decisions for the community, including who was going to be that person. And the name actually was then assigned to this person. So imagine if the senator from Massachusetts, both senators, they had different names, and then there was an election, and it was only elderly women, say over the age of 50, who could choose that person. And then when that person was chosen, they were given that same name, okay, not the senator, but be a name, and he would hold that name, and all the records and everything would show that person's name. And if he ever did something they didn't like, they'd choose another one. So it wouldn't be like every 6 years. It would be when or until death, and then the women would choose another one. That's really, really, really different. Another thing that's different is that the Confederation always operated by absolute consensus. None of this, majority vote. None of this supermajority. None of this 2/3 or 3/4. Everyone had to agree, or nothing happened. Also, the Confederation largely existed, and there's lots of evidence for this, as a means to coordinate defensive policies. If the English were threatening, then the council would meet to decide what to do. And they might not be able to agree on anything, so some of and this is actually true during the 7 Years' War, where the Mohawk Nation and the Oneidas supported the English, and the Senecas and another one, I forget which one, supported the French. And there was one that kind of tried to stay out of it altogether. And by the way, the 6th Haudenosaunee Nation, the Tuscaroras, were never allowed to be part of the Confederation at all. They didn't get to elect anyone at all. They got to sit on. So that seems really, really different, okay, just in terms of substance. And the language, okay, if you read the language of the delegates at the Confederation, at the Constitutional Convention, it's all about Enlightenment language. It's all about Enlightenment ideas, and they're looking at Holland's experience. It's all European language and European ideas. So it's just, I understand why there's this desire, but from my point of view and a lot of other people's point of view, Native organizations, traditional organizations, they're wonderful, right? Why do you want to claim to be part of another system?
you've got something unique to offer. Be proud of that. And they are. They absolutely are. So that's kind of my take. Like I said, there's obviously passionate feelings on both sides about it.